Hey, it's Dan Gilmore, Supply Chain Digest and the Supply Chain Television Channel. Very pleased to be here on another one of our Supply Chain Thought Leaders video broadcasts. Today, talking about vendor compliance management. Of course, vendor compliance has been around for probably 3 decades or so, something like that, in the retail sector, particularly in the soft goods part of that, but beyond that as well. But that's kind of where it's been noted. And now is it time for other sectors to start looking at those principles? That's something we're going to discuss today with somebody that's extremely well qualified to do that. That's Richard Wilhjelm. He's a VP of Sales and Marketing at Traverse Systems, a company that delivers vendor performance optimization solutions, kind of bundled underneath that as vendor compliance. He's coming to us, I believe, from Florida. Richard, as always, thanks for coming here today on the Supply Chain Television Channel.
Thank you for your time, Dan.
Okay, let's just kind of get everyone on the same page. Certainly many people are well familiar with the concept of vendor compliance, but for those that aren't, particularly in other sectors outside of retail, give us just a quick overview of what it's all about.
Yeah, Dan, vendor compliance in the retail business has been a tried and true and tested best practice for, as you mentioned, up to 2 to 3 decades now. Basically what it is a process where the retailer publishes a set of expectations, typically known as a vendor requirements guide, and then in turn kind of measures those results or those expectations against the vendors or the suppliers' performance. A couple of examples of that is on time and in full, also known as OTIF now. Second is, did the shipment come in damage-free? Did the shipment have proper documentation? And what I mean by this is, in a physical sense, the documents, but also in an electronic sense. Did it have a usable ASN? And the final piece was the shipment. Did it come in on the right carrier? Was it collect versus prepaid? Did it come in the correct number of days? That type of thing. So again, a practice that has been tested in the retail business for many years now, very popular. And I think the reason why is that if that vendor or that supplier adheres to that vendor requirements guide, typically both parties benefit, not only in the form of higher sales, but also of lower cost as well too.
Yeah, very good, nice kind of summary there. You know, one of the things I think that's, and you and I have talked about this in other contexts on the Supply Chain Television Channel, this focus on OTIF, on time and in full, that has really changed over the last few years, and people like Walmart and Target and some others kind of leading the charge.
Dan, without question, we are seeing an uptick in this area. I think it's really for a couple of reasons. The first is the well-documented, the well-publicized online competition. Won't spend a lot of time there. But the second, I think, are the emerging customer facing technologies. I'll give you an example. One is BOPIS, or buy online and pick up in store. When that retailer publishes that on-hand quantity, in essence, they're not only publishing their supply chain performance online, but they're also betting their brand's reputation that amount's going to be correct. And if it's not, they know the competition is just a click away. So again, a lot of activity in this area.
Yeah, very, very interesting what's happening there. Okay, so I think it's well understood by most, certainly if you're in the retail and or soft goods area, some other hard goods, consumer goods industries, you understand this very well. But what you're seeing, and I've seen some evidence of this as well, is that the notion of vendor compliance, however you want to term it, vendor performance management, whatever it happens to be, it's starting to move outside of those retail sectors where it's been so prominent into some other sectors. What can you tell us about that?
Sure is, Dan. Now, when I speak of traditional retail, I mean, as you mentioned, apparel, soft goods, traditional retail stores. Where we're starting to see it expand is really into kind of 3 areas. The first is grocery. Although grocery is retail, typically in the past there hasn't been a lot of interest in vendor compliance. What I think has changed there is not only the aforementioned emerging technology or consumer-facing technologies, but also there's probably not a traditional grocery store chain in America today that is not competing against either Target or Walmart. And as you highlighted, these companies have had these practices in place now for 20 to 30 years. Second area that we've seen is what we call digitally native vertical brands or direct to consumer, whatever you want to call them. Those companies that don't have a physical presence per se. In the past, they've been very growth focused, and cost haven't mattered too much. But I think things are changing a little bit. Like their brick and mortar brethren, if they don't have it in stock, they can't sell it either. And so a big emphasis on OTIF in the direct to consumer arena. And then the final area is wholesale distributors. You know, that traditional stocking online distributor typically has more vendors, has more SKUs or part numbers as they call them, than a traditional retailer does. So fairly complex supply chains. At the same time, they have initiatives in place where they're trying to reduce inventory, trying to shorten their purchase order life cycle and cut costs where they can. Dan, I think what we are seeing is kind of a blurring of the lines between retailers, digitally native vertical brands, wholesale distributors, and in certain cases, manufacturers. Each of these sees these consumer-facing technologies as a way to get closer to the consumer. It's not only enabling them, but it's also, I think, it's emboldening them as well too. So business as usual in the past is no longer the case, and it's contingent upon all these firms to have a high-performing supply chain.
Yeah, just very good, Richard. Just a couple quick things. I think you're absolutely right that this drive to OTIF performance is certainly being driven in part by e-commerce. So let's start with that. Second, e-commerce itself, whether it's traditional retailers or those digital retailers, as you talked about, brings up some whole new kind of requirements, and certainly things about in terms of like on time, but also things like vendor drop ship performance. Is the vendor complying with the requirements for that, which can be rather substantial. And then I think the wholesale vertical is just an obvious one because it shares so many characteristics with retail. Some cases they actually have physical quote unquote stores, so let's say that. And then also just the many, usually they have many vendors across tens of thousands of SKU bases and all the kind of things that go on there. So it's a natural, and I know we had a conversation about 6-9 months ago where you said you've seen some cases where personnel went from a retailer to a wholesaler and said, hey, we got some vendor issues here. Maybe compliance is the way to solve it. So I think that's all very, very relevant, and I think I've also seen some of the interest in these other sectors, as you mentioned, grocery especially, but wholesale as well. So are the tools the same? Are the tools you use, whether that's the technology, the process, the goals, is it the same in these other sectors as it's always been in retailers, or differences?
Dan, well, the processes may vary slightly, but for the most part, if that enterprise can provide us with a purchase order and a receipt, as well as the quantities, and then we can provide them the tool set to not only measure, but hopefully improve their vendors' performance, as well as provide them a picture of what their purchase order life cycle looks like. And more importantly, the corresponding opportunities to reduce it. So again, varying degrees of differences in the processes, but for the most part, they probably have more similarities than they do differences.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess, the one thing taken away, and I think especially, as we kind of talked about with the OTIF and whatnot, at the end of the day, I think things have really changed and will change in these other sectors as well. It's becoming very much about supply chain performance, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I would argue that it's always been about performance. I know in the past there's been some retailers that have probably abused the chargeback process. But at the end of the day, whether it's a retailer, a wholesale distributor, grocer, direct-to-consumer firm, I don't think it really matters. At the end of the day, if you can provide a higher-performing supply chain, that leads to a reduction in inventory, reduction in transportation cost, reduction in DC personnel and warehousing cost. At the end of the day, that's going to far outstrip any chargebacks that any of these individual firms will charge. And as a side note, I think in the past, particularly in the retail business, it was about, if you could out merchandise your competitors. Well, I think it's different now. I think it's about who has the highest performing supply chain. And supply chains, in essence, are competing these days. So I think now supply chain performance probably matters more than ever.
Yeah, you know, and a thing I just say is, and we've had some discussions on this as well, if you can reduce the variability, the supplier-driven variability that's coming into your supply chain, there's big dollars there, there's no question. Richard, it's been a great conversation. Best of luck as you look at these new markets, and come back sometime soon on the Supply Chain Television channel.
Always a pleasure, Dan. Thank you very much.